this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In this episode of the World War II podcast, we'll explore the Royal Navy from 1918 to the end of the Second World War and one man's career. Not an officer, but a regular sailor, Herbert Leeder, who chalked up 27 years of service. Following the career of one sailor is an interesting way to view the Royal Navy. It gives us a slightly potted history, but Herbert did take part in a number of major actions during the Second World War, and it really brings home how one man can be a witness to many great events. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me today is James Carter. After working as a volunteer researcher for a local history project during the centenary of the First World War, James was inspired to seek out the history of his own great-grandfather when his mother handed him a 4-page summary of Herbert Leeder's career. The outcome of that research is Hearts of Steel, which tracks Herbert's career and the Royal Navy in which he served. Jim, thanks for joining me. Let's start with Herbert. He enlisted in the Royal Navy aged 18 in 1918. I did wonder how he'd managed to avoid being conscripted into the army during the First World War. Who was Herbert? Was there a naval tradition in the family?
No, there didn't seem to be. No, there didn't certainly seem to be. Although the lady that he married, her father, he was in the Navy and he became Coast Guard. But there's a tenuous link. Herbert and his family were literally very poor labourers, brickmakers. They were all brickmakers. You go back with the father, he was a brickmaker, and his father before him was a brickmaker. So it's a pretty dull existence.
Where are they from? I've forgotten.
Swanton Novas, which is right up in Norfolk. This large estate, which is Melton Constable, I think. Yeah, they had a brickmaking there, and that's just what they did. There were lots of leaders in the village, which gives you an idea. There were an awful lot of leaders.
People didn't travel far.
No, they didn't. No, they didn't. They did fall on hard times pretty quickly and ended up in the workhouse. He was born into just a real poor family. I think somehow made his way. Again, he's gone into the workhouse as a young boy. He was 11 years old when he went into the workhouse with his family. And what I sort of got from the way that the workhouse has developed, because you always think of it a Dickensian sort of view.
Well, I was going to say, you forget that at the time of the First World War, you're at the start of the 20th century, they still exist. You kind of think of Oliver Twist, don't you, in the 1850s?
That's it, exactly. But by then, the government was really looking at welfare. They didn't encourage people to go into the workhouse, but it was a place that you could go and live. You could still have your job outside, but you got fed, clothed and watered, basically. And hopefully you got into a position where you could get yourself out of it, as well as they looked after the old and infirm. I just get this impression that Herbert wasn't silly. He wasn't daft. And, he probably decided he wanted to get out of there. And that's how he ended up on the railways as an engine cleaner. And that runs quite deep in our family. But that would have possibly given him a chance to become a fireman and a driver.
Is the engine cleaner literally going into the engine, clearing out the soot?
Yeah, they'd just prepare the engine for the day. Young lads would go and join the railway. That would be their first job. They'd be cycling down, waking up all the firemen and the engine drivers and making sure they got up and went to work for the day. And then they'd go off and do this and prepare a locomotive for the day's work. And there was usually about 7 of them doing that job for one loco, getting it ready. And so I think he was looking at an engineering background of some sort. He was mechanically minded. And certainly I understood from my aunt that when he came out of the Navy, he loved motorbikes and tinkering with engines. So I think that was his thing. And then how he got into the Navy, again, I'm not sure. I'm fairly certain there was a process where you could try and decide on where you were going to go.
I think that if you left it to chance, you go into the army. I'm not completely sure of this, but I think you could volunteer for the Navy, which would allow you to avoid being conscripted into the army.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you're dead right. Because the Royal Navy was rather more selective, certainly, because they were looking for the cream. And I did find this recruiting poster from Great Yarmouth, which was advertising for stokers in particular. And it basically was saying, we're going to give you a uniform. We're going to put a roof over your head. We're going to pay you quite a good wage, and you might be able to travel. And this is in the time of war, They are recruiting in 1918. As you say, there must have been a chance to say, well, okay, I'm turning 18. I'm going to go and speak to these guys and volunteer. And I think that's what he did.
Sign up before I'm enlisted.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And then off he goes. And they still had 6 months training then.
Do you know what the Royal Navy basic training was like? Because this is also, it's very much a wartime Navy. I know the Royal Navy is not necessarily out fighting gigantic battles. The Jutlands happened previously.
16, yeah.
16.
But they still took their time to train the guys up. So they brought them into the Navy he was a boy seaman, basically. He didn't go to Ganges or anything. He was actually trained at Portsmouth. So they went on to HMS Powerful, which was a training ship. It was an old ironclad in effect. They had to learn how to swim. They were given their uniform. They had to put their names on their uniform, all that kind of stuff. And so they were gradually indoctrinated into the Navy. So I say, by the time he became an able seaman, the war was just about finished in November. I think that it was 1 in 4 got into the Navy. So you had to be pretty sharp to get into it.
1 in 4 who applied.
Yeah, who applied, yeah. So to answer your original question, I don't know a great deal about him as a person, obviously, because all I had was his service record. But when you pick the bits out and look at it and say, well, engine cleaner, there's a workhouse engine cleaner potentially trying to be a stoker. There is a pattern there, and there is a path to where he ended up.
He's married in 1924. Do we know what he's been doing up until his marriage? Because it's 24 he goes on is that his first major?
25 to 27. He served on 16 ships in total. His first big ship was HMS Centurion, which was a battleship. And that ended up as a breakwater at Normandy in the end.
That's a pre-First World War dreadnought, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, yes. She was, I can't remember what date she was built now, but she's a typical looking big First World War type battleship, big piece of kit. So he was on her for a short while, and then he was assigned to a number of different destroyers, just operating out of Portsmouth Channel waters. They would swap and change quite quickly. They might spend a month on one ship, then come off that and go on to another. So he's got a list of different ships that he's fiddling about on.
Must have made them quite dexterous, learning, here's a new ship. How does this one work? Oh, here's a new ship. What's the layout of this? So it must mean that by the time they get on their longer deployments, they're very experienced at being able to be put on anything and just getting on with it.
Absolutely, yeah. So they're quite experienced hands by then. In fact, just going back, he was on HMS Hermes, which was the first purpose-built carrier, from her commissioning for the first couple of months. By the time he goes abroad to the Far East on Effingham, the Hawkins-class cruiser, as you just alluded to, he's got quite a wide breadth of knowledge. He has to have done, he's going to be quite an integral part of the crew.
Yeah, and presumably he's been up to that point. They're operating on the home fleet in and around Britain.
Yeah, just the home fleet. Yeah, so he's around in and around Britain, in the Channel, up to Scapa Flow, that kind of stuff.
He gets married in 24, and very quickly have kids, don't they? Do you have any idea how long are they away and coming back? It's sort of odd thing to be a sailor. It's not like you come home at 9 to 5, is it?
No, that's right. You're in barracks or you're on board ship. So yeah, he's not. It's difficult to tell in that period, where he's swapping and changing ships, how much he's at home, or because it just says he joined the ship on this day and he left it on that day. So you don't really know what's happened in between unless you can find the ship's logs and that kind of stuff. But I think he was in and out of port. He probably got a bit of leave here and there. But as you say, he's probably not spending weeks at home on leave. But somehow he's met Kathleen, and it's almost a tradition in our family. She ended up pregnant before they got married. So because they were certainly discouraged. The young lads were discouraged from getting married and having relationships because I guess there was a chance they'd be going away for 2.5 years at a time. So my grandma Doreen has turned up, or she's on the way, and he's probably had to go to CO and say, "I need to get married because my girlfriend's pregnant," and he's got married. So yeah, Doreen was only 10 months old when he went to the Far East.
That's a 2.5 year deployment.
Yep, 2.5 years it was at the time. Yeah. Though I don't think that changed until the 50s. It was still 2.5 years.
It's a tremendous amount of time to be away. I mean, if you're with little kids, especially.
It's massive. And I've done a couple of talks lately where I've said, well, if you try and put that into perspective, if she's 10 months old when he's gone, he'll have missed her first steps, her first words. She wouldn't have even known who he was. He's come back. Who is this man that's walked through the door? That's your dad. It's a massive amount of time.
Especially for kids. And especially in a time, presumably, where phones don't exist. The only way to contact one another would be letter coming from halfway around the world.
Exactly. And that would take ages to get back. Yeah.
And they get crossed and they get the wrong orders. And
yeah, that's it. Ronald. Yeah, that's it. And I think there was a bit with one of the chaplains on that first one that was saying to the crew, don't forget to write home. You've got to remember to write home to your family.
So it's the Effingham, isn't it? He goes to the Far East on, which is a Hawkins class heavy cruiser. So what is a Hawkins class heavy cruiser? I'm terrible on ships.
That's all right. Well, it's about 10,000 odd tons. It's quite a big 700 plus foot long ship. It's got a number of, I can't remember off the top of my head how many guns it's got, but it was pretty state of the art cruiser. They were new, and there was a crew of about 750 on board. Quite a tight knit community. They were pretty powerful. So it was a big ship at the end of the day, and a big presence. I think what they were looking at in the East Indies and China Station, that ilk, they were looking for some presence, and that's what it could bring. One of those Hawkins class cruisers could bring presence and project that might of the British Empire, as it were, and the Royal Navy.
Well, they're based at Trincomalee in what is now Sri Lanka, weren't they? So what were they doing out there for 2.5 years?
When you read the book on the commission, they had a lot of fun, an awful lot of fun. The primary purpose was to protect the trade of rice and sugar around Burma and the like, and then it was hearts and minds and that kind of stuff. So it's going around and visiting all the ports on the East Indies Station. So the East Indies Station is 3 million square miles of water, and it ran the continent of India all the way down the East African coast, across to Mauritius, and then over to Burma. So it's huge. Obviously, it had major ports all the way around it, and those ships would then go off and visit those ports. They'd go on a cruise. They'd even call it a cruise, and they'd go on a cruise and visit all these ports, and they'd just be entertaining. There'd be some diplomatic work that the admiral might have to do, parties, ceremonies. They organised a tournament once. I mean, it's amazing reading the book. So obviously they had a military duty as well. They did exercises and stuff, but they were having a bloody good time at it as well. And of course, morale was the big thing with the crew, because if you've got guys that are going to be away from their family for 2.5 years, you've got to keep them occupied. So it was all football, rugby, cricket, shooting matches, boxing matches.
Well, did they get time off on a 2.5-year tour?
Yeah, they were getting time off. They were making sure that when they were in port, those guys were kept active, not necessarily just sitting on ship lounging about. We're gonna field a football team. We're gonna field a rugby team, but they just kept them active.
And Trincomalee presumably is the home port. So do they also have a land base there? They would get extended periods of time off based on barracks there.
Yes, yeah. So that would be the camp period. There's basically two ports that they would use. They'd use Colombo, mainly for refitting, from what I can tell, and Trincomalee as the deep water port. And then partway through the commission, they would go for a period of camp. And camp was basically where the ship would put into Colombo. Half of the crew would be sent off to a place called Dietalawa, which was in the Central Highlands, which is tea plantations and like. So half the crew go to camp for about 3.5, 4 weeks, and the other half of the crew stay behind and look after the ship. And then after that period, they swap over. And at camp, again, the guys would be able to go walking, play golf even, go to society meetings, play matches, go for runs, that kind of stuff. But overarching that, interestingly, the midshipmen, who were the trainee lieutenants, would be given a platoon of guys who it was their responsibility to look after. to make sure that they were, they had decent mess quarters. They got up on time. They cleaned up. They went to breakfast, and they went to their recreation on time. And they were overseen by lieutenants and the like. So it had a purpose for that as well. But the real thing was to get the guys off the ship, which was, as you can imagine, was hot. There's no air conditioning in that thing. Prickly heat was a big problem for them. You think about prickly heat when you're a kid. You get it in your elbow, or whatever, and it's really uncomfortable. But they would get it in the groin, under the arms, and it would be really debilitating for them. So to get away to camp where it was a better climate gave them a chance to just feel more at home, as it were.
I wasn't quite sure, actually, and I was actually trying to think back to Belfast, and I couldn't remember what point the Royal Navy starts to introduce sort of men with their own spaces, almost like cabins, or are they still on hammocks at this point? They roll up at the end of the day.
Yeah, they're on hammocks. So the lower decks are on hammocks,
which is really remarkable. That you think of the Royal Navy at this point being much more modern, don't you? And you're still on hammocks.
They're still on hammocks, yeah, and that went right the way through till when he's on Nubian as well. So even the destroyers and the like, they were still on hammocks, which amazing.
Well, that's what pirates sleep on. You kind of.
Yeah, yeah, I know.
So when they return, again, I'm not quite sure. You sort of alluded to this in the book. I wasn't quite sure. Are the families aware of the movements of the ship? So when they return, the families know when these things are coming back.
Yeah. So I was picking up from one of the newspapers in Portsmouth. They would be regularly reporting where ships were in peacetime, obviously. In peacetime it did. And of course, if something like Hawkins or Effingham was coming back, they would start to do its progress to when it came back. And they would be therefore letting the families know that your husband or loved one's ship was coming home when it was going to arrive. So yeah, there was quite a bit of that when you look back.
You've got 700 men. That's a lot of family to welcome a ship home.
Exactly. And I don't think it was a great deal different to what you see when ships come back into port these days. There's usually a big welcoming party for them. There's the paying off pennant, and the guys line the ship, and it comes in, and the families can go aboard and see their loved ones. And I don't think it was any different in the 1920s as it is now. Just that they were away for a lot longer.
2.5 years is a long time. So what happens to the crew at the end of the tour? Are they dispersed from the Effingham, or do they remain on the ships? I'm not sure how long they're expected. Is there a sort of a designated time between long deployments?
Basically, what for Herbert, and I assume this was for a lot of the guys, they come off the ship. The ship would probably have to go through a bit of a refit. I think Effingham did actually get turned around and go back out to the East Indies without him on board that time. But he would likely be then assigned, you see in the service record, it will say Victory. And that Victory is not HMS Victory as we know it. It was the name of the barracks, which I think is Nelson now. So they possibly go into barracks for a while, then be dispersed and reassigned to another ship. So you see him fairly quickly go from, say, Effingham, Victory, and then assigned on to other ships.
He spends time in the home fleet now, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's back into the home fleet again. So in between, he was on a couple of little survey ships in between before he went off on Hawkins for the second time. So yeah, a couple of years back in Portsmouth, fiddling about before he gets assigned back out to the East Indies again.
Again, this is 32. He goes back out to the East.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, 32.
He's now got 3 children.
That's right. So he's got 3 kids by then, a wife, and how the hell they kept those relationships together just beggars belief, really, doesn't it?
Well, I did find it. So you found the book by the Reverend Ray, produced Nil Desperandum. Reverend Ray releases a book of his journeys on the Hawkins, doesn't he? How does he reflect upon his East Indies tour?
I think he thoroughly enjoyed himself. I'll come back to him in a second, but I didn't mention before I got both books. So in those days they made these they built these books up written by the crew. Is usually what I mean. Effingham's book is probably better than Nil Desperandum because it really is it's contributions from all the crew on little pieces. So it really gives you a great flavour of what they were doing. Ray's book is a bit different. His one is slightly different in that he indulges a bit in the first bit because he buggered off on holiday he got leave for some reason, and he went off and disappeared for a few months visiting friends in India. So that bit of the book is a bit, oh god, so I'm not going to learn a lot here. But then he does start to talk about time on board, and again, it's similar stuff. It's all about parties and playing sports. And
He talks about hippo hunting.
yeah, I was going to say, yeah. So they got the officers got to go off on safari, and he basically says they shot at everything they could see. They see a bird in a tree right over there, they never go at it. It doesn't really sit well with current conservation. They just went out and blasted everything that they could, but it was different times and different mentalities.
Yeah, it was what they did. Is it Zanzibar he was hippo hunting?
I think it was Mombasa, actually. I think it was Mombasa that they went. They went to try and shoot these hippos. And then he ended up taking photographs of them, which really, really annoyed a lot of the guys. I have this picture. They were in this little canoe. And, the size of a hippo is huge, isn't it? And they're in this little canoe. I think there was 3 of them and a native guy. And they decided to land. And then this hippo comes crashing out of the undergrowth. And they shot the poor thing. They shot it. But the native runs in and cuts the head off this hippo and insists that they take it back on the canoe. I mean, they said, no, we can't do that because it'll sink it. but amazingly, then he talks about how everybody came round and they actually devoured that thing on the spot. Not a bit of it was left. So, as I say, those kind of things don't sit well with the way we are today, but they're fascinating to read.
Well, it's how Western sensibilities at the time meets the locals and how they do things differently. It's an interesting sort of snapshot, I guess, looking back. It's just so bizarre. It almost sounds like a Monty Python sketch. We took the afternoon off for a bit of hippo hunting. Earth are you talking about? It's very colonial British sort of view of looking at things. Because the other thing that there's a massive fleet review, isn't there, for George the Sixth in 1937? Does Herbert take part in that? What's the fleet review like?
Yeah, so at that time he's aboard HMS Iron Duke, which was the Jellicoe's his flagship at Jutland. But by then her teeth have been pulled because she's come under the knife of the Washington Treaty. She's had 1 or 2 turrets removed, and she's gone into HMS Excellent as a gunnery training ship. So Herbert is aboard her for about a year, I think it was, quite a while. And she takes part in the fleet review, and she's actually moored behind Barham and Queen Elizabeth, one other, and she's actually in front of Hood. So both Barham and Hood end up being sunk, but they in the Second World War, obviously. But the fleet review is unbelievable. I got hold of the souvenir program, a copy of that, and the map in there shows that it's got 8 lines of ships over a 10-mile bit of the Solent, from Portsmouth right the way down to Yarmouth on the Isle of Wight. 145 British warships in that review, and you think that's actually only part of the Navy, because there's still ships in refit, ships in build, ships around the country in different ports, ships abroad. It's massive. It's just unbelievably massive. I should think that was something to behold watching that.
Oh, but I did wonder actually if he's down in the engine room, if he ever actually was allowed to go and stick his head up to see what it all looked like.
I think they would have been, yeah. It would have been something to see. I've got a photograph. It's on my website, actually. There's a photograph of Iron Duke at the 37 review with all the bunting up, and it looks very, very smart. So I know he's on board that ship at that point. And I believe he had a copy of that picture on his wall. So it obviously was an affectionate time for him to be on Iron Duke.
It's sort of one of the last great hurrahs of the Royal Navy, isn't it? What a tremendous thing, as you say, 100+ ships. But that's 30. So it's the following year, 38. He is 38. So he's got 20 years of service. Do you know when your time was technically up in the Royal Navy? How long what's the contract period they're signing up for?
12 years. So he signed on for 12 years. So he'd come to the end of it, and he signed on again. Now, I couldn't work out, I think it was for another 12 years, but I think what that ended up being was not hostilities only is the wrong word for it. There was obviously hostilities crew, but I think it was as a case of he signed on again. Potentially, once war has begun, he'll get demobbed at the end of it, which he did. He did get demobbed at the end of it, basically. But by that time, he's had an awful long 27 years in it.
It's funny. You think 1938. You look in. You think, well, actually, you must be you might not. That's not fair. We know with hindsight wars on the horizon, but obviously things are happening in the world. But I guess you don't know what bubble people are living in and might not notice things or choose to not see them. Or
exactly. I think there was obviously a feeling that it was certainly looking bad, wasn't it? But you just if you try and put yourself in their shoes, as I think you're alluding to, you didn't know. You thought something might happen.
Well, the other thing is, I mean, he gets back from the East Indies on the Hawkins, and then it's disarmed in 1937. So you think, oh well, maybe, I thought we were rearming. What are you disarming a ship for?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I know. There were certain ones they were disarming and others they were bringing up. But that's right, because Hawkins and Effingham both went through a massive refit. Actually, Effingham didn't look a lot like she did in 1927. She originally had 2 funnels and they replaced it with one big one. So she looked quite a bit different. She looked a different beast, really. And I think Hawkins did much the same. So they were modernised, but he wasn't. He was going on destroyers, not on those 2.
Well, he's on the HMS Nubian, isn't it? Next. So this is a tribal class destroyer, of which I'm aware of the tribal class destroyer. I'm not completely aware of what actually they particularly are. And these are brand new ultra modern ships, aren't they?
Yeah. So in 1927, there was a brand new ship, a bit of destroyer shipbuilding. They were replacing some old destroyers, and they had a program where they would build eight new destroyers a year from 1927 onwards. And as that program was going on, just go back a bit, those destroyers were based really around anti-submarine warfare and anti-shipping, torpedoes and depth charges with gunnery included. What the Navy or the Admiralty realised was that I think it was the Italians and the Japanese started to build these bigger destroyers, big ones. They were more gunnery orientated. They still had torpedoes and depth charges, but they had plenty of guns on them. They actually sat somewhere in between a destroyer and a cruiser. They're a bit too big to be a destroyer, and they're not quite big enough to be a cruiser. But they ended up calling them destroyers. And so the tribal class was born out of that design or that requirement. They called them Victory class to begin with, fleet command destroyers. But they became known as the tribals because they were all named after tribes. And there were a couple of batches of them built before they reverted back to building what they call the J and the K and L class lighter destroyers that goes back to a more anti-submarine and anti-shipping role. So the tribal sits. The tribal sits somewhere in the middle of that destroyer but rebuilding program
between 2 classes of ship.
And they were big old beasts, 377 feet long, near 37 knots, so pretty quick. They had 4 pairs of 4.7-inch guns. They were state-of-the-art bits of kit. There's an interview with Dwyland Bush, who was ended up the first lieutenant on Nubian, and he said that the crew was certainly the officers were handpicked. Some of the more senior people like Herbert were handpicked to build up an experienced professional crew for those ships, and then they would have young lads come in that they would mentor.
They're deployed again is this another 2.5 year deployment where they're the Med?
Effectively, the deployment would be roughly 2.5 years in length as we're coming into wartime. So the first assignment they had was to go out to the Mediterranean before the war and to be part of the East Indies station over there. So they were fiddling about in the Med on exercise, Spanish Civil War's going on. There's nothing major to do that. It's mainly training.
So what did they evacuate prisoners from the Spanish Civil War? Was that their first?
Yeah, that's right. They were.
I thought it was such an odd sort of side story that no one talks about.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so Nubian didn't get involved in it, but they sent one of the cruisers, and I can't remember its name now. I think it might have been Calcutta, but I'm probably wrong there. But they detailed one to go to one of the Spanish ports and evacuate the civilians off there.
Jim, we're going to pause it there for a break. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by James Carter and we're looking at the life of Herbert Leeder. With war closing in, it's a step up from ceremonial duties, cruising around Africa and India. And
Very much. Although they did get a bit of that in the Med at the time. There was a great big exercise out of Gibraltar every year. And there was hundreds of warships there to do that. Once that was over, the destroyers would go off in pairs and cruise around the French Riviera. So they'd have a bit of a break. Of course, that all ended fairly quickly, actually, because we were running into World War II. But that's what they would do. They would just go off and have a bit of a break and go and sit by the beach for a while. So it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So after that little period in the Med, when the war breaks out, and she's sent up to Methil, up in the Firth of Forth, and then she's on convoy duty between Methil and Bergen. So just going backwards and forwards on iron ore, and she did a dozen or so of those runs, and then got involved with the Norwegian campaign.
You don't think of necessarily the Navy taking much of a part in it.
No, that's right. And everybody concentrates on Narvik, but she was involved in Operation Hammer and Sickle, which were down at Namsos, attempting to take Trondheim. So she was involved basically with escorting the troop ships into Namsos, dropping them off, and then actually taking them off again in about 4 or 5 days' time, because it was a complete and utter disaster. She kind of became a command and control ship by accident. It was General Carlton de Wyatt, who was in charge of the British forces and the French to some extent. He went aboard quite a few times and was sending signals back to England and getting his orders organised. And it's quite interesting because the commander of Nubian, Richard Ravenhill, he says in a report that he sent back, he really felt quite overwhelmed because he's on there commanding his ship and he's got a general on there asking his advice. Felt a bit awkward basically over that. So and he was quite a formidable character. I don't know if you've seen a picture of him.
Yeah, I've got his biography somewhere.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's fantastic. One eye, one hand, half his ear blown off. Incredible guy. Spent most of the 20s and 30s shooting in Poland, didn't he?
Yeah, that's right. Even the hospital that he used to go for his injuries even had his own pair of pajamas made for him. That was brilliant. So she was heavily involved in that, and then of course the evacuation ended up in the sinking of Afridi and Bison, the French destroyer. So they would witness that, and then after that Norwegian campaign, she went back to the Mediterranean.
What was her biggest threat in the Norwegian campaign? Were the Royal Navy under threat? Because it's seen as being an army operation, but you just alluded to ships being sunk.
It was air power at the end of the day.
This is what we'll see in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, exactly. So the Germans were deploying Heinkel 111, Ju-88s, and Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. And it's probably fortunate that the Ju-87s, that they were just sort of beginning to realise they had a good anti-shipping role to play, and they were really good at. That's what they were really good at. So we had no air cover at all, really. I mean, there was some stuff off the carriers, but they were sat quite a way offshore. So air power was that blitzkrieg type warfare with Ju-87s being forward artillery effectively was devastating, and they were learning an anti-shipping role. So that was going to be, as you just alluded to, that's going to be really important for them in the Med.
For the Mediterranean. Well, I did wonder when they get to the Mediterranean if it's a bit of a relief for them, feeling that perhaps they're in the Mediterranean, they're going to get a bit more of a conventional naval role, because the Germans don't have a lot in the Mediterranean, yet the Italians have a large fleet, don't they?
Massive, yeah. Well, the Italians have not only, I think they were the 4th largest surface fleet at the time, and with some very modern ships as well. They were well-built ships and fast and very capable. But also the Italians had a very big air force as well. And whilst they could deploy high-level bombing on the British ships, whilst it wasn't overly accurate, I should think it was incredibly intense being underneath it. And they were really good at reconnaissance, the Italians. They would send out a reconnaissance aircraft, spot the fleet, then circle it just out of range, work out where it was going, where it was going to be, and then send out the bombers to attack them. So They were trying to coax the Italian fleet out, but they were generally getting attacked from the air most of the time.
The home base is Alexandria in the Mediterranean, isn't it? What's that like as a port for sailors like Herbert?
If he could get some time off, well, it's a big port, obviously. It was quite a hostile environment in many ways. It wasn't recommended you walk the streets alone very often. They had the Fleet Club there, and the Fleet Club was massive, and that was a place where the sailors could go and get a drink. They could stay overnight and relax. And I think it was over several acres, this place. So it was a big old spot. Alexandria Port was huge. It was obviously stuck out on a limb. It's a long, long way from England. There was no real chance of getting home.
Obviously, there's a lot of army transit camps and things going on in and around Cairo, and I wasn't quite sure how it compared to Alexandria as a naval facility as opposed to all these massive army facilities where people are coming and going.
Well, the Fleet Club entertained the army as well as the Air Force and the Fleet Air Arm. So it was kind of I see it as a bit of a hub, really. So it's a big naval base, obviously, at the end of the day. But you've got attached to it with the airfields the aircraft on the carriers would go off the carrier and go to airfields, and the army would be in Cairo as well. So I actually think it's a big, busy place from a military perspective, and vitally important, obviously, for protecting the Middle East.
So Nubian over the Second World War racks up 13 battle honours. She's only exceeded by Warspite, which is incredible. And now Herbert's there for at least 1, 2, 3. I've got about four, if not 5, listed in front of me. That's quite a lot.
I think he's all bar 3.
Oh, I mean, it's incredible. As I say, it's a funny way to view the Royal Navy through one man's career and then realise how one man can be at so many pivotal places. It's almost a bit like Flashman, who appears to pop up everywhere.
Yeah, he does.
So June 1940, we're looking at Calabria.
So it's Calabria, Operation Judgment, which was the attack on the Taranto harbour. So she's slightly involved in that. Battle of Matapan. And then you've got the Greece and Crete. So that's 5. And then she was on the force out of Malta that went to do convoy role. So that was another battle honour. And then coastal bombardment along the North African coast supporting the troops. She was almost constantly at sea. You look at the record, they never really got a chance to go and have a break. They come in thinking, oh, we're going to have a few days here, boys, let's go ashore. And then be told, oh, no, sorry, you've got to turn around and go out and protect this convoy.
Well, it's suddenly when you've had your 20 years service of cruising around playing cricket and shooting hippos, you suddenly realise why you're being quite well paid when you're
that's right.
constantly at war and not allowed off the ship. So the Battle of Calabria is significant because that's one of the largest ship-to-ship battles in the Mediterranean, isn't it? That's what the Royal Navy's there to fight.
Yeah, it was a bit of an anticlimax, really, when you look at it, because all that really happened in the end was Warspite lobbed a shell. I think it was 14 miles or something like that. It was a massive one shell, and it went smack onto the battle cruiser. And I can't remember which one it was now, an Italian battle cruiser. And then they put up a huge smoke screen and disappeared. So that was a bit of an anticlimax. Matapan's the bigger one. But Calabria was the first, as you say, was the first sort of big engagement where the Italian fleet had been coaxed out to meet the British.
And he's there when Illustrious is hit, the carrier, with the only carrier we have in their med.
Yep, that was part of Operation Excess, and Nubian was part of the escort of the fleet screening duties of Illustrious. So yeah, she was there when Illustrious was completely tonked by Stukas. I think she got 7 hits, didn't she? 7 hits, but stayed afloat. An incredible bit of seamanship to get her back into Malta, and a real testament to the build quality of those armoured carriers. He took a right pounding. The German guys that trained, they were specifically sent down there to sink her. They reckoned that it would take 5 bombs to sink her. And it took, well, they never did.
Which is, as you say, it's incredible. It leaves them in the Mediterranean with no air cover.
That's right. Yeah, even less. Yeah. Had air cover for a minute and now you've got none.
And you've got on. They have to wait for Formidable to arrive, which takes a few months.
Takes quite a while because the Suez Canal had been mined as well, so she was stuck out in it's the Red Sea, isn't it? Stuck out there for a while. So it took a little while to get her in, and then she could be deployed in the Med to provide some vestiges of cover. but they're still pretty limited. I mean, there was nothing really on Malta. The fighter cover was being kept back. It was Leigh Mallory, wasn't it? He's keeping it all back for trying to do these ramrod raids into Europe.
Well, we're not long off Battle of Britain. We're looking at June 1940, France's fallen. We're looking at January 1941. The Battle of Britain sort of has petered out for the winter. Do we know what's going to happen? Do we need our planes? And all the time we have a fleet that's been attacked by the air. You read through and it's just constant air attacks. And you wonder, was the fleet prepared to fight a battle where its main enemy is from the air and not another fleet where it could just lob shells at one another or fire torpedoes or drop depth charges?
Yeah, it is mainly from the air that the threat comes. I mean, they're trying to coax the Italian Navy out, but they don't particularly want to play ball, and all they do is get bombed all the time from the air. And you got to remember that actually in those days the anti-aircraft armament wasn't particularly good. They couldn't elevate more than 40 degrees on the destroyers because there was the doctrine that the battleship would always win through. It would always defeat air power. That was poo-pooed as soon as Prince of Wales and Repulse went to the bottom of the sea. So, I mean, they had to learn very quickly during that period that if you haven't got the cover there, you could be in trouble very quickly. And in fact, that did bear out mainly in Crete. Prior to Crete, the doctrine was that all you had your battleships and your destroyers together, and you stayed together as a unit and protected each other. But at Crete, they dispersed a bit, and all those ships that dispersed pretty much got sunk because they were suddenly without mutual support from other ships. So yeah, that was a bit of a lesson. Cunningham writes about that. He says we seem to have forgotten what we'd learned.
Is it Crete that Nubian's Luck finally runs out and she's hit?
Yeah, so she was escorting Formidable. It was a mission called MAQ-3. So Crete, the battle for Crete is basically the whole of May, and at the end of May, they've already lost 7 ships by then. I think they lost 9 in total, all to Stukas. All to air power. So they think, right, well, let's go and attack Scarpanto airfield and let's go and bloody their nose. Well, that's fine, but by that time, Formidable she'd already been on a thing called Operation Tiger, I think it was, and the natural attrition of aircraft just left her with 4 Albacores and 4 Fulmars. So the Fulmar was the fighter cover, and the Albacore's a light bomber. So they're not going to be able to do a lot to Scarpanto airfield at all. But they sent the battle fleet out, and Formidable, and Nubians protecting her, and they send her out. They have to send her out at night because they daren't go out during the day. Send her out at night. They launch this raid, which is, shall we say, successful in inverted commas. They beat it up a bit, but that's about all they can do. And then as the fleet's on the way back, STG-2, Stuka Group of 2, find them and attack Formidable. And they do serious damage to Formidable. That puts Formidable out of the war for another, it's not quite 12 months, but it's an awful long time. But Nubian gets caught. The tactics that they deployed was to draw off the escorts first. So attack the escorts, draw them off, and then go back in and hit the carrier, and then go back and then go and hit the destroyers. And Nubian was, shall we say, unfortunate in that she was avoiding and trying to protect Formidable, but as sneaked up behind her came a Ju-87, and it was an unusual thing. It didn't do a dive bomb attack, as we know, not a screaming dive bomb. It just crept up behind and sort of did a lobbed this bomb, and it landed smack on the stern of Nubian and blew the back end off it. I think it killed 14 guys. Most of them were under 20. There was a secondary explosion because one of the depth charges went off, and all the CS gas at the back went off. When they create a smoke screen, the white stuff that went off, and they couldn't see anything. The rudder had been shot away, and the back end was gone completely. The whole of Y turret, the aft turret, was gone, but the propellers were still intact, and she could still make 25 knots, but she couldn't steer. Couldn't steer with a rudder, but she could steer with engines. Slow one side downhill turn. So they did manage to get her back to base, despite being attacked on the way as well. So she did outmaneuvered further dive bombing attacks. I think what's the the real funny thing is the captain said anything that is superfluous to the ship, it needs to be chucked overboard. And he said some expert threw all the officers' washing overboard, which he wasn't very pleased about. I think he says it with a tongue in cheek, actually, when you read it. But yeah, some expert.
I just find it incredible that you blow the back of the ship off, but somehow it could still limp home under attack. It's like one of those wartime propaganda movies to buoy everyone up. Come on, we'll get through as we come home.
And it wasn't just steering it as well; it was balancing it. You know, they had to flood tanks and all that kind of stuff and make sure it was on it. Yeah, so a hell of a feat of seamanship to get that thing back.
And they get she goes to India to be refit, but doesn't she? He's not written off the war. It's
Yeah, that's right. So they have to jury rig her up with a rudder, temporary rudder, and because the damage was so extensive, it couldn't be done in Alexandria or Port Said. So she had to go out to the yard in Bombay, or Mumbai as it is now, and be repaired there. So she didn't go back into service until 1942, I think it was, back into the Med. Herbert wasn't aboard then. He'd gone to North Africa and was shore base for the rest of the war. But it was almost 2.5 years to the day that she'd been commissioned as well. So that's quite a coincidence. But she had quite a big career in Med again. She was at the invasion of Sicily and also at Salerno. Interestingly, I found the fire missions that she did supporting the troops at Salerno. And it's all from the forward observers and saying what the mission was, what the range was, what guns were fired, and what the effect was. That's pretty cool.
I hadn't realised that there was major repair bases in Bombay. Of course, there's going to be. The British Empire can't bring all its shipping back to the Clyde. They're going to have these facilities everywhere. It was like, oh, that's interesting. Of course, there would be. The world is bigger than Britain. This is what comes back to me during the Second World War. The Second World War, Britain was a global nation with a global outlook. We had global bases to do things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I think oddly we forget that now. We have all these bits all over the place. You said he was from then on port base, presumably Alexandria. Do you know what he was doing?
He was actually up at Bizerta. It's right up in Libya. He was on 2 shore bases, one called Hasdrubal and one called Hannibal. And I can't find much about them, about what they did. I think he probably just had fairly menial duties. I mean, they must have said, "You've done your time, you've done your bit. Go and be a clerk or something." But I can't find. If anybody knows, do let me know. But I can't really find much about what those two shore bases were. I believe they were there for the build-up of Sicily, the invasion. So they would have been. That was going on in Bizerta at the time. But what those 2 bases did, I can't find head and a tail. I've searched everywhere. So if anyone knows, shout, let me know.
You mentioned before that he's, in theory, he was signed up for another 12 years, but he leaves. When does he leave the Navy? He doesn't do his 12. He doesn't do his 20 or 12 years, does he?
No, September 45. He's released. I can't remember. They call it a category, but it was basically you were no longer required. Off you go. So
the war has ended 2 or 3 weeks before BJ Day, and he's gone. That really is first in, first out.
Yeah, 27 years, job done. And then he died in 65, the year I was born.
20 years later. So what did he do after the war? Did he stay in maritime world?
No, I think he had a pension by then, quite a nice pension. He had a house and the wife and had motorbikes. I think he tinkered.
But he'd be only 45 in 1945.
Yeah, that's right. He wouldn't have been that old. But I don't know what he did, in all honesty. And my grand's dead now, so she can't tell me.
This stuff gets lost, doesn't it? Or if people sort of potted about, or rather than do a thing, necessarily like we do, you're not necessarily a thing, you did things.
Absolutely. He didn't have a second career, as it were. His career was the Navy, and I think after that he just tinkered. Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is amazing. As I said at the start, looking at the Royal Navy through the lens of one sailor's career is a fascinating way to view life at sea, from those interwar years through to the war itself. Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. Loyal listener, if you want to read more about Herbert Leeder's life and times, James's book is Hearts of Steel. I will put a link on the website. Don't forget, this podcast is made possible with the kind contributions of listeners like yourself. If you do not already do so, why not sign up to a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And I thank all of you who support the show. Well, that is all from me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.